And now for something completely different.
"1955 was a very weird year for the world. The world was still coming to terms with the wreckage wrought by the Second World War. Large parts of our civilization had been laid waste, and the process of rebuilding had only just begun. The scale of the violence of the war years had left us with a collective trauma, a sense of vertigo, as we examined the ruins we inflicted on each other and what it meant to be human in the wake of such inhumanity.
The Russian leaders wait beneath the Soviet and West German flags at Moscow airport to welcome their most significant visitor to the Soviet Union since the war, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer of the Federal German Republic.
1955 is the year that the war between Germany and the Soviet Union officially ended. The Warsaw Pact was signed, and the European Union created, and the Vietnam War began. In the face of so much political upheaval, the international currency became information, intelligence. Grand networks of spies and intelligence officers spanned the world, all of them in pursuit of information that might give one nation some small advantage over the others, as the power structures were reshuffled and former allies became enemies. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, everything you're about to hear is public record. Welcome to Bat Country. In 1955, MKUltra The CIA's secret program of human experimentation in the search for drugs that could be used in interrogations was already 2 years old. MKUltra was the offspring of the earlier Project Artichoke, an initiative of the Office of Scientific Intelligence with a specific mandate: to investigate whether a person could be induced to commit an assassination through mind control, hypnosis, and the use of psychedelic drugs. For years, Project Artichoke, originally named Project Bluebird, was a rumor, with any linked document subject to condemnation as forgery and conspiracy theory, until the CIA released many of its own files in 2002. MKUltra, the program that emerged from Project Artichoke, was formally acknowledged by the CIA in 1975, but not before most of the documents were destroyed on the direct order of then CIA Chief Richard Helms as a result of governmental panic in the wake of Watergate. Destroyed because of the heinous nature of the contents. Human experimentation on US and Canadian citizens, usually without their knowledge, much less consent.
I was given a glass of Kool-Aid, and so were the other children. This Kool-Aid was spiked with LSD. It was horrible.
Widespread human experimentation began in the war years, most extensively by German doctors in the service of National Socialist science, and Japanese doctors testing biological weapons on Chinese civilians. The Germans saw some justice at the Nuremberg doctors' trials in 1947, but in Asia, the experimentation continued, with the Chinese, previously victims, now turning these techniques against American POWs during the Korean War. MKUltra was America's response.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing.
Systemic anti-communist paranoia at the top levels of the CIA led them to conduct the kind of widespread human experimentation that only mirrored the worst behavior of its enemies, and all in search of one thing: truth. MKUltra's objective was to find the perfect truth serum, a mind-controlled drug for use on valuable prisoners from the Soviet bloc, and then, perhaps, to develop a mind-altering drug to allow America to secretly manipulate foreign leaders, most notably Castro.
En las condiciones de la inmensa mayoría de los países de América Latina, no hay otro camino que la lucha armada.
The experimenters themselves were most interested in the effects of psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, and more. The CIA sought data on any substance that induced delirium, anything that disturbed normal thought processes, and they were willing to forego the ordinary ethics of peacetime in the pursuit of a chemical that, they thought, might prevent future international war and maintain American superiority. Many names emerged from MKUltra with which you might be familiar. The poet Allen Ginsberg, Grateful Dead songwriter Robert Hunter, mobster Whitey Bulger, the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, and murderer Charles Manson are all among MKUltra's alumni of psychedelic victims. But another name emerges that will be familiar to few: Harris Isbell. Harris Isbell was not a victim of the CIA's illicit mind control program, but a perpetrator of it. Born in Arkansas in 1910, Isbell was a pharmacologist whose initial interest was in the nature of physical dependence and addiction. Over his long career, he published or co-authored a massive 125 papers on the effects of various drugs, including opiates, synthetic opioids, barbiturates, amphetamines, ibogaine, THC, multiple psychedelics including LSD, and alcohol. Isbell's stellar professional record and close specializations in drug use and withdrawal made him an excellent candidate for the CIA and its unethical MKUltra research into mind-controlled drugs. And much of the funding for his research came from that organization. Despite his modest Arkansas upbringing, Isbell had a flair for the kind of inhumanity that those sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials in 1947 might admire. One account, in Jim Keith's 1999 book, Engineering Human Consciousness, describes Isbell's use of African American heroin addicts in his experiments. In exchange for a promise of heroin, Isbell subjected 7 of the men to high doses of LSD for 77 straight days, and used electric shocks to wake them when they fell asleep. In the 2011 book, From Healing to Hell, author W. Henry Wall Jr. describes how his father, a doctor and former senator, had his mind ruined by Isbell's experiments. Wall's father had become addicted to Demerol after a dental procedure, and it ultimately landed him in the Lexington, Kentucky Center for Drug Addiction, known even then by the nickname Narco, according to first-hand accounts. There, he came under the dubious care of Dr. Harris Isbell and was subjected to a barrage of drug experiments. In that book, Wall writes, "My father had been kept on in Lexington beyond the usual cure period. The additional time was to allow Isbell to observe and record his behavior following the drug assault. Even when he was finally sent home, Having received no treatment of any sort for his drug dependence, Isbell made no provision whatever for psychiatric or medical follow-up. I found it heinous beyond belief that this violated man, still prey to paranoid flashbacks, was simply turned loose to his bewildered family and whatever fate might overtake him. The sudden onset of Daddy's terror of being driven insane and of mental derangement persisted as paranoia for years after his release. Given his interest in altered states of mind, in 1955, Isbell turned his attention to one of the most poorly understood states of delirium yet known: delirium tremens. In 1955, Isbell published a paper titled An Experimental Study of the Etiology of Rum Fits and Delirium Tremens. Its contents are shocking even today. Delirium tremens, known previously by the nickname the rum fits, is characterized by extreme confusion, terrifying delusions, and horrific hallucinations. Untreated, it is incredibly dangerous, with a mortality rate of between 40 and 50%. Even with modern treatment, around 12% of people who experience delirium tremens will succumb. The mind-altering nature of the hallucinations and the propensity for bizarre delusions made the condition of supreme interest to Isbell and, by extension, the CIA. Ostensibly, his paper, The Etiology of Rum Fits, simply reports the findings of an innocuous medical study conducted by Isbell and his colleagues into alcohol withdrawal. The findings are still quoted today. But, given the nature of Isbell's career, we can assume this research was funded by MKUltra, and a look beneath the surface reveals a predictably sadistic human experiment. It's hard to believe today, but before the publication of The Etiology of Rum Fits, there was serious skepticism about a connection between alcohol withdrawal and delirium tremens. In fact, the medical consensus was the opposite, that there was no connection. Hospital records of delirium tremens from the time indicate that the condition often began while the patient was still drinking, and therefore could hardly be assigned to alcohol withdrawal. Further, most patients who sought medical treatment and received it did not experience delirium tremens at all. But Isbell makes his first argument in the second paragraph of the paper. Those patients who sought treatment were often treated with paraldehyde, a central nervous system depressant used to control convulsions, which may be the equivalent to continuing to give alcohol. In an effort to prove his suspicion that there was a connection between alcohol withdrawal and delirium tremens, and more likely, to give himself and the CIA the opportunity to study if anything useful can be learned from the altered mind state, Isbell devised a cruel and agonizing test. He brought together a group of 10 volunteers for an experiment. In truth, the 10 men were convicts and heroin addicts, with multiple first-hand reports that Isbell was offering access to heroin in exchange for their participation. They were to be given the maximum amount of alcohol their bodies could handle for 3 straight months. And then the alcohol suddenly stopped, and the withdrawal monitored and untreated for 2 weeks. In other words, a group of criminals were to be forced to drink as much as possible for as long as possible, and then monitored as they went through withdrawal with no medical intervention. That was the plan. It is, to date, the only known experiment into delirium tremens in live patients. Methodology. Given Isbell's history, it's reasonable to assume that the institution was the aforementioned Kentucky Center for Drug Addiction, or NARCO, though the paper does not mention it by name. The 10 men were under constant observation 24 hours a day by attendants who had been specially trained for the experiment. In Isbell's words, these conditions ensured absolute control over the amount of alcohol consumed. The amount of alcohol they were to be prescribed was calculated according to their body mass, and the plan was to administer alcohol amounts sufficient to maintain the maximum degree of intoxication compatible with safe ambulatory management continuously for 6 to 12 weeks. In short, they were to be kept extremely drunk to the point of losing consciousness, but not beyond, for weeks on end. All of the subjects were morphine addicts with at least 3 months of sobriety, presumably because they had been pulled from the prison population and therefore had no opportunity to use. The risks had, allegedly, been made clear to the group, and they had all been subjected to various psychiatric tests, among them the long discredited Rorschach ink blot tests. As we will see, the Rorschach tests reveal more about the biases of the doctors than the patients. All the patients were long-time heroin addicts and career criminals with psychiatric diagnoses of either character disorder or inadequate personality. They had been chosen for having served previous sentences and had long records of addiction to narcotics, vagrancy, and antisocial activity. It's clear these 10 men were selected because it's unlikely they would be missed should they die. Meet the patients. Red was 40 and quit alcohol at the age of 24 after becoming addicted to heroin. His profile describes him as arrogant, boastful, and regularly incited the other patients to cause trouble. His IQ was recorded at 113, and his Rorschach test indicated a character disorder and homosexual tendencies. One wonders how that conclusion was deduced from a Rorschach test. Maurice, 33, had no history of alcoholism, but had been a heroin addict for 3 years. He had an IQ of 92, and his Rorschach test indicated considerable guilt, anxiety, and, somehow, sexual sadism. Again, it seems like the doctors were projecting their own preconceptions of the patients onto the patients. Bob was 34 and a heroin addict for 5 years, and had a history of alcoholism. A shy and retiring man, his IQ was 90, and his Rorschach test indicated passivity and confusion over his sexual identity. Tom was 45, the oldest of the group, and a heroin addict for 26 years. When not taking heroin, he drank heavily. At times, he was hyperactive and joyful, other times depressed. His IQ was 96, and his Rorschach test indicated depression, but was otherwise typical. Al was 29 and addicted to heroin for 8 years. He had no history of alcoholism. His IQ was 93, and his Rorschach test hinted at a character disorder with narcissism. Jack was 30 and had been an addict for 12 years with no history of alcoholism. His addiction had caused him to lose the business he had inherited from his father. He had an IQ of 102, and his Rorschach test indicated little capacity for inner living, as well as feelings of inferiority and anxiety. Charlie was 34 and an addict for 17 years with periods of alcoholism. Charlie was friendly, willing to be the butt of other patients' jokes, but was given to occasional fits of anger. His IQ was 98, and his Rorschach test indicated an emotionally infantile individual. Junior was 26 and the youngest of the group. He was funny and agreeable, with no history of alcoholism. His IQ was 96, and his Rorschach test indicated poor emotional adaptation. Slim was 43 and had been addicted to heroin since the age of 16. He had previously experienced delirium tremens. He was quiet but hostile to authority. His IQ was 118, and his Rorschach test was characterized by evasive responses and non-committal answers. And finally, Tony was 35 and an addict for 8 years. He was the oldest of 9 siblings and married. He was pleasant and affable, though a little shy. His IQ was 126, and his Rorschach test was also characterized by evasive and non-committal answers. It requires no scientific background to acknowledge that the Rorschach tests to which these men were subjected were nothing short of worthless, and served in most of these cases as a way for the experimenters to further diminish the humanity of the patients. One suspects they may have been included as a gesture towards scientific credibility, but there is no insight contained within those results that could not have been drawn more accurately by a simple conversation. For instance, the diagnosis of Red's homosexual tendencies could not possibly have been deduced from a Rorschach test. It just happens that Red was openly and identifiably gay. Maurice had been aggressive to one of the doctors, and that entered his record via the Rorschach test as a tendency for sexual sadism. The experiment, Part 1, Preliminary Period. The experiment was divided into 3 periods. A preliminary period for control, a period of chronic intoxication lasting up to 12 weeks, and then a final period of sudden abstinence and withdrawal. Afterwards, the subjects would continue to be monitored for a 3-month recovery period while the paper was being written up. The experiment began with a barrage of physiological and psychiatric tests. The men were moved to a secure ward with no outdoor access and were first tested to make sure they were sober. The men were examined physically, subjected to röntgenograms and electroencephalograms, and their blood drawn. The laboratory determined their red and white blood cell counts, urinalysis, blood sugars, non-protein nitrogen, serum sodium, potassium and uric acid, serum bilirubin, serum electrophoretic patterns, cephalin flocculation, thymal turbidity, and a number of others that sound equally outdated to a modern ear. Their temperatures were taken rectally, and their pulse and respiratory rates, systolic and diastolic blood pressures, and general behavior were all regularly noted. The report notes that, in general, before the experiment began, the subjects were cooperative, clean, and neat. They assisted with tasks around the closed ward and joked with the staff that they should start drinking as soon as possible. Maurice kept to himself for much of this period, as did Bob, and they were unpopular in the group. Jack and Al were also quiet, but mingled better and played cards together. Red bragged often about how he regularly deceived the police and boasted about the amount of drugs he could handle. Tom, the oldest, was described as hyperactive, elated, and silly. Charlie became the clown of the group. Junior, the youngest of the group, and Tony became friends and spent much of the time laughing and joking with each other and indulging in horseplay of various sorts. Slim was quiet and took on the role of keeping the ward clean. All the pieces were in place. It was time for the experiment to begin. The experiment, Part 2. Period of chronic intoxication. The amount of alcohol administered to each of the subjects varied according to body mass, but in general, each was initially given a half shot of 95% ethyl alcohol, essentially pure alcohol, every 2 hours between 6 a.m. and midnight. They were administered by an assistant, and the subject would be given a chaser of water or fruit juice if they thought they were going to vomit. At midnight, and again at 3 a.m., the subjects were given a triple shot of ethyl alcohol to allow them time to sleep without sobering up. The goal was to bring the subjects up to a constant state of drunkenness. In modern terms, the subjects were to maintain a blood alcohol level of around 0.25, more than 4 times the legal driving limit in most jurisdictions. Breath tests were used to measure the alcohol levels, since, as former heroin addicts, it was difficult to draw blood intravenously. To achieve this state of drunkenness, the size and regularity of the shots were increased over a period of 5 days. If vomiting occurred, the amount would be reduced but the regularity increased. Should the subject want more alcohol than prescribed, it seems to have been available, and one gets the sense from the medical report that, in practice, the subjects may have been encouraged to drink far beyond the scope of the experiment. The same psychiatric and psychological tests had been planned to continue through the period of chronic intoxication, but, in Isbell's words, this proved to be impossible because of the patient's confusion and inability to cooperate. In other words, they were too drunk for the Rorschach test. In fact, all the patients exceeded the amount that was considered the average amount of alcohol that can be metabolized in a day, and 4 of them regularly attained a level that was regarded as the maximum intake possible. For example, Al, at just 76 kilograms in body weight, drank an average of 475 milliliters of 95% ethyl alcohol for 79 days straight. To put that in perspective, it would be like drinking somewhere between a quart or a liter and a half gallon or a handle of vodka every day. At the start of the experiment, half of the subjects complained to the medical staff that they were not receiving enough alcohol and were drinking an amount that only made them feel sick. As the doses increased and results began to come in, that attitude would change. Maurice, our 33-year-old with perhaps the shortest period of heroin addiction, 3 years, and no history of alcohol, became, in Isbell's opinion, very noisy, boisterous, and obnoxious. He withdrew from the experiment after 6 days of drinking. Red, identified as having homosexual tendencies by the Rorschach test, would boast loudly about sexual activities deemed abnormal by the examiners. He was irritable and difficult to manage. He also withdrew from the experiment after only 16 days. Bob, on the other hand, was generally quiet and never belligerent. However, he would often refuse drinks and complain about the drinking schedule, and left on the same day as Red. One wonders if, given the note on his record that he would lead others to trouble, Red might have influenced that decision in an attempt to stir up rebellion among the subjects. Tom, previously noted for his elation and hyperactivity, became extremely depressed, to the point that his role in the experiment had to be ended after 34 days of drinking. Charlie, marked out as being emotionally infantile, became extremely boisterous and somehow gained an enormous amount of weight. But after 60 days of hard drinking, that changed, and he would often be semi-comatose in bed throughout the day. He showed marked tremors in the mornings, despite the high volumes of alcohol he was still consuming. He lasted 78 days. Jack was angry and wanted to fight. He also gained weight, and his personal hygiene declined rapidly. 43 days into the experiment, Jack developed debilitating hiccups, and his alcohol intake was reduced by half to relieve them. After 12 hours on this reduced schedule, he also began to show physical trembling, despite drinking nearly the equivalent of a fifth of vodka through the day. That night, Jack complained of terrible nightmares in which groups of people came in through the window and walked all over his bed, and he fought with them. The hiccups stopped. He resumed drinking, and alcohol was discontinued after 79 days. As we previously noted, Al drank a huge amount of alcohol, and yet he rarely seemed heavily intoxicated. As a result, his behavior during the experiment was generally well controlled. His alcohol was stopped after 87 days of drinking. The Experiment, Part 3. Abstinence, Withdrawal. Maurice, who stopped drinking after 7 days, and Bob and Red, who drank for 16 days, sobered up quickly, with tremors and sweating that Isbell characterizes as nothing more than a severe hangover. Tom, who drank for 34 days, and had been so depressed that his experiment had been stopped, trembled greatly, had high blood pressure, and didn't sleep for 3 days, after which he recovered. The remaining 6 suffered far worse. Slim, who drank for 55 days, developed tremors 8 hours after his last drink, as well as profuse sweating and heart palpitations. He vomited extensively and did not sleep. On the 5th night, he began to hallucinate and believed a murder was happening in the hallway outside his room. He ran out to intervene and was assured by the doctors that he was hallucinating, which he accepted. He woke up screaming repeatedly. No more hallucinations were reported after that, and he recovered quickly. Al, our heaviest drinker, developed tremors and anxiety 8 hours after the last drink of his 87-day binge. He was so weakened that he couldn't sit up, let alone stand. On that first night, he hallucinated a decapitated, mummified head, the eyes of which followed him as he moved in bed. When he closed his eyes, he would see a dwarf, which vanished when he reopened them. 10 days later, he had recovered, apart from the unusual weight gain. Jack developed the same weakness, sweating, and anxiety 12 hours after alcohol cessation. The following day, the tremors had subsided and he seemed to be recovering. But on the second night, he began to hear voices outside his window. He heard baseball games on the radio, although it wasn't turned on. All night, he saw the faces of people he didn't recognize. The hallucinations subsided by day, but on the fourth night, they returned more severely, and he began screaming at the other patients, convinced that snakes were coming up from the ground where they were standing. The following night, now going 5 nights with no sleep and no longer oriented with space and time, he thought his bed was flying and attributed it to the attending doctors who he believed were doing it to him deliberately. The following morning, he believed he was being attacked by an animal that spat acid in his face. He fell asleep for the first time in 6 days and had fully recovered a few days later. Charlie, however, nearly died. Less than 8 hours after he received his last drink, he was extremely weak and vomited repeatedly. His blood pressure was high, as were his breathing and pulse. At 12 hours into withdrawal, he had a grand mal seizure followed by delirium. He would go on to have another 6 seizures before the doctors intervened to end the experiment and save his life. His body temperature was measured at 41.4 degrees Celsius or 106.5 degrees Fahrenheit. When he was able to talk, he gave a long and detailed account of leaving the ward to visit his mother, and when prompted, would give convincing anecdotes about his journey, none of which actually happened. It took 6 weeks before his condition returned to normal. Junior drank for 48 days and began to vomit and experience severe anxiety 8 hours after his last drink. He began to complain of seeing things 12 hours after the last drink, including dogs in his room and a TV set that wasn't there. 15 hours after his last drink, Junior became very weak and saw egg-shaped insects on and around his bed. He would go on to see people peering into his room from the doorway and a snake with hands. All night he saw crabs and disembodied faces. On the second day, he seemed to recover rapidly until, at 41 hours after his last drink, he suffered a grand mal seizure. He would recover thereafter. Tony's blood alcohol level dropped slower than everyone else's, and at 8 hours after his last drink, he recorded a 0.27 blood alcohol content. He was still singing and dancing in this period, but it seems he was about to get a very severe case of delirium tremens. Just 16 hours after his last drink, Tony began to be very disoriented, weak, and nauseous. He got no sleep on the first night and hallucinated throughout it, and had tremors, sweating, and diarrhea. He constantly heard phones ringing and was unable to sleep at all. On the third day, his hallucinations became incredibly vivid. He believed a Sicilian gang was trying to kill him with a gun that could shoot around corners. He believed he was being stabbed and was constantly fighting off attackers. For the next 3 days, Tony continued in this manner, unable to give the time or his location, and continually fighting off attackers. His hallucinations were sometimes sexual in nature, and he often believed people were insulting his sexuality. By the 6th day, his delirium had still not subsided, and he had begun fighting the assistants on the ward, believing them to be gang members sent to assassinate him. As his body temperature began to rise like Charlie's, and his life became endangered, he was finally sedated. When he woke the next day, most of the delirium tremens had subsided. 2 weeks later, he appeared to be normal. After 3 pointlessly traumatic months, the experiment came to an end. Findings. Although the sample was mercifully small, with only 10 subjects, there were some revealing insights into delirium tremens. Needless to say, the experiment confirmed beyond question that delirium tremens and convulsions were a manifestation of sudden alcohol withdrawal, contrary to the scientific consensus of the time. Of the 6 patients who drank for 48 days or more, all experienced some severe form of withdrawal, despite very few of them having been alcoholics in the past. All had tremors, weakness, excessive sweating, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, high temperatures, high blood pressure, and debilitating insomnia. 5 experienced delirium tremens with hallucinations, disorientation, and delusions. 2 of them had serious convulsions and seizures, and a 3rd required intervention to prevent a seizure. By this estimation, the consequences of withdrawing from alcohol are more severe than those of withdrawing from barbiturates. It was noted that tremors might manifest in hours after the last drink, and may already fade away when hallucinations begin, somewhere around 2 or 3 days after the last drink. Isbell concludes that the amount of alcohol and time spent drinking required to initiate delirium tremens varies from person to person. He speculates that it would require drinking between 770 to 950 milliliters of 100 proof whiskey for 48 days or more to induce a withdrawal serious enough to progress to delirium tremens. But there's another finding in this experiment which is overlooked even to this day. Isbell states, "The evidence that delirium tremens and rum fits may occur while individuals are still consuming considerable amounts of alcohol is formidable and cannot be disregarded." This has implications in the modern treatment of alcohol use disorder. Isbell is telling us that it is possible to begin to experience alcohol withdrawal symptoms even while you are still drinking. An insight borne out by anecdotal evidence from alcoholics today. In his words, if an alcoholic has been consuming a quart of whiskey daily and has kept his intake spread throughout 24 hours, he would be expected to have a high blood alcohol level and to be quite drunk. If, for any reason, he is able to obtain only 1.5 pints of whiskey daily, all the alcohol could be metabolized, the blood alcohol concentration would decline, and withdrawal symptoms might ensue even though he was still consuming what is usually regarded as a large amount of whiskey. Conclusion. Isbell's paper concludes as follows. Abrupt withdrawal from alcohol from chronically intoxicated persons is followed by a definite abstinence syndrome, which, in some patients, includes convulsions or a delirium or both. But that's not the conclusion of the story. So, what happened to the man himself? Revealingly, in 1962, while MKUltra was in full swing, and while Isbell was certainly leading human experiments in the service of the CIA, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy awarded him the U.S. Public Health Meritorious Service Award. Robert Kennedy described Isbell as an extraordinarily able director and coordinator of multidisciplinary research and an outstanding investigator in his own right, whose work in clinical pharmacology has exerted far-reaching influences. It is perhaps ironic that Robert Kennedy would later be assassinated by the enigmatic Sirhan Sirhan, who was alleged to have been a victim of MKUltra experimentation. Isbell retreated from public life and became a researcher at the University of Kentucky's medical school in the late 60s and refused all subsequent interviews. The book Narco Brat, written by Marjorie Seneschal, the daughter of one of Isbell's colleagues who grew up in and around Isbell's addiction center in Kentucky, states that Isbell was the only person at the hospital with the security clearance required to know their work was funded by the CIA. According to Seneschal, Isbell died in 1997, his own life shortened by a dependence on alcohol. The research of doctors like Isbell and other even less reputable human experimenters before him is often quoted today with a disclaimer to highlight that, while the results are useful, they were obtained unethically. After all, we have Isbell to thank not only for a better understanding of delirium tremens. His human experimentation is also behind the clinical use of opiate antagonists like naloxone, better known as Narcan, and for the availability of methadone as a treatment for heroin addiction. Isbell is the doctor who cleared the way for those treatments. In one sense, Isbell and experiments like this one destroyed countless lives. In another sense, they may have saved countless more. Thank you for watching, and as always, good luck out there.